Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. My two colleagues have said everything I possibly would want to say. So I don't know how much I can add, but I will try to add it from the international law perspective.
Will you speak up a little?
Yes, can you hear me in the back?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, okay. So what I'm going to do is talk about what war does to law, and what I'm going to present is going to have three parts. Part one is international law and the American project since 9/11. Part two is bringing light to dark matters, and part three is about the deal, so to speak. To start in my introduction, there's something I wanted to encourage to say that I really felt was important to bring to your attention, which is this at the beginning, which is a wonderful book by a guy named Hans Fallada, F-A-L-L-A-D-A, who wrote in the 20s and 30s and 40s in Germany, and he was a dubious kind of character about how he was acting with the Nazis because he stayed in Germany. But he wrote a book that came out in 2009 in English called Every Man Dies Alone. And it is based on the true story of a couple named the Hempels who lived in Nazi Germany, who I think the son was killed in the front. They got so upset with Hitler that they wanted to rebel in Nazi Germany. So what they did is they wrote 3x5 postcards where they wrote things like, Hitler's an asshole. And they went to public places and they dropped them on the ground. Okay? And in the book it talks about this. And the guy had the idea, he was a working class fellow, and in the book his wife says, this is absurd, dropping little postcards. What's it going to do to Adolf Hitler and all that? And the husband said, you're right, honey, but if we get caught, we'll be killed. So when you feel despair about the things that you work on and do, I love that image of this couple in Nazi Germany dropping postcards, which in a sense most people will think is extremely meaningless. But in fact, they risked their lives enormously by doing that. And so when you think things are bad and the effort's here now, just remember those folks in Nazi Germany taking that risked their lives, just dropping a postcard on the ground. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to start to emphasize is a wonderful book that at least has freed my mind enormously by a guy named Francesco Alberoni, A-L-B-E-R-O-N-I, and it's called Movement and Institution. He's an Italian sociologist. But the English version came out in 1984. And what he did is, in that book, he's been studying for 30 or 40 years, he analyzes movements. He doesn't care if it's communism or capitalism or the Catholic Church or it's two people falling in love, which he calls a movement of two people. But what he loves is to analyze how movements happen. And one of the things I love about what he wrote was that he starts with the idea of how someone gets to the point that they start to think about doing something that ultimately becomes a movement, that real early stage stuff. And the thing that I love about what he wrote, at least for me it had meaning, was that he talks about people getting to a state of between the contradiction between what they feel inside and what they see in the world. It becomes terrible, this contradiction between what they understand as sort of what is right, what is real, and what they see in the world. He has a wonderful term for it, which is called depressive overload. And in that state of depressive overload, where you just don't feel right, but you can't articulate it maybe for whatever reasons related to you, all of a sudden you do something. One image we always have is of, why am I spacing out now? On the Lady Roosevelt. It's like electric, it's in the air, it's ether, you see. It's like Rosa Parks on the bus deciding one day, not to stand up. But we can go through a million things that we've seen where, the sit-down strikes, the things down in North Carolina with the unionizing that people, but but somebody gets sick of their situation, or there's that old Johnny Paycheck song, take this job and shove it, variations of that moment. And then the second aspect of this is that this idea happens for I want to do something. And that is called, what he uses a term I love, called the nascent state. That's the idea of sort of changing out of the normal way of seeing things. The next aspect of that is you seek people like you. That's called affinity in this stuff, where we all try to find each other. We're here together seeking people to have affinity. And as we develop that affinity, it creates a movement. And that's how movements get started, by that moment of depressive overload, to the nascent state, to the affinity of movement stuff that happens here. The other thing I loved about what he wrote was the second part, which is about how institutions or everyday life hits those movements. And essentially, the rest of the structure hits us in 4 ways that I love that happens, that the movement is successful or not. And I won't go through all of that, but he really lucidly lays out all of those aspects that says that every frustration that we have in the process of developing this movement and it having any success on anything we've talked about, he kind of says, yeah, it's one of those 4 things that the state or the institution or the put it figured out do. So I'm just saying that nothing new, there's nothing new under the sun. There's an important effort that we all have to do, and that we should feel some encouragement in what we're doing by the fact that these things have been thought about and can happen, and that change with sustained effort, as you described here, can occur. I just wanted to start with that, which may sound a little theoretical off to the side, but I just found these 2 things particularly hopeful for me as I sit here today, even though there's a lot of despair about whether we can actually change anything that we've talked about before. With regards to Jeff's presentation that just happened, the thing I wanted to emphasize is that Jeff's presentation talked a great deal about what happens inside the United States under our constitutional law. And that is essentially what you're all trained to wait to think of the world. And one of the things about this that is so significant is the following, that there is an effort actually to prevent you from even knowing what international law is that is systematic in this country. There is a whole political game about we shouldn't use foreign law, which is associated and made to be a part, or foreign law is considered to be the same thing as international law. There was a recent case of a dean of the University of Tulsa Law School who was supposed to be put up to be a candidate for possible judgeship on the 10th Circuit in Oklahoma. The Senator Tom Coburn allegedly has blocked her nomination because she knows something about international law. I can't believe this shit. But there you go. There you go. This is where we are in America today. Okay? So now, back in 1900, radical times like that, there was a case in the Supreme Court called Paqueta Habana, or some people call it Paquita Habana, depending on who, which is about some fishing boats that were captured in the war, the Spanish-American War off of Cuba and all that. But that's not the key point. Is back in the day there, this radical Supreme Court of 1900 said that international law forms part of the law of our land. Okay, so that they were obviously Al-Qaeda plants. I mean, I'm just trying to let you know that this is like very insane. So please understand. I watch this and I'm going to just say now there are some things that I think are really useful about international law. For example, after 9/11, when we were talking about non-state actors all of a sudden coming to war with us as being this new thing and the new paradigm, and what the new day was the term, right? So I was worried about the Democratic-Republican thing, so I decided to pick up a book from 1625 by a guy named Hugo Grotius, who I figured wasn't a Democrat or a Republican, right? And see what he had to say about the law of war and the law of peace. That's actually its 3-volume set. It's a very useful book for you to read. It's long. But what he does in one section of it, he says, there have been wars, public wars and private wars. Private wars between princes and princes, and wars between princes and private men. And he goes back to the Romans, fighting the pirates. Okay, so there have been non-state actors going against states back to the Romans. So in case you thought Al-Qaeda was this new deal, no, nothing is new under the sun. I'm telling you, we go back to the Romans. So please free your mind of that. Please free your mind of that. Okay?
Spelling on his last name, please.
Grotius, G-R-O-T-I-U-S. Hugo Grotius. He was a Dutch guy who was trying to enamor himself of the prince, so he thought he'd write a wonderful treatise, and he's supposed to be the father, one of the fathers of international law. Okay. Now, I want to say also that I am not totally enamored of international law, because, for example, one of the people who was the initiators of the law of human rights law, the famous human rights law that we all hear so many wonderful things about, was a gentleman from Spain who was looking at the issue of Indians, or Native Americans in the New World, and issues like, they had souls, and they were humans, and they had rights, and sort of a religious tradition. And his conclusion was that the Native Americans in the Spanish areas of the New World were humans who had rights, who had to be respected, and all that, in the context of the Spanish coming in and taking over, and the whole sort of colonization taking over process that happened after the 1500s. So, of course, the problem was that his solution to the problems they had was, let's import slaves from Africa to do the work as opposed to the Indians. This is the father of human rights. So you gotta have it. It's in this period. It's heavy. It's heavy. It's in this period. One of these things to do. So I'm giving you a little background on international law. It's not sort of this pristine, wonderful space. It is what it is. So with that, now I'll go to the introduction. I'll talk about international law and the American project since 9/11. Well, international law is basically made up of two things: treaties, agreements between states, and what's called customary international law. I'm here to report that since 2001, international law has not changed. As far as I'm aware, there are no new treaties with regards to the stuff, international humanitarian law, human rights law, or anything like that. Let's say that everything he described is okay. Secondly, customary international law has not changed, i.e. that the practices of states, there have been practices of states that have occurred in all that period, but whether those practices have been as accepted as law, i.e. made a legal obligation, no. For example, when the European Union folks helped to do the extraordinary renditions and people were tortured at bases outside of former Soviet bases in Poland, that doesn't mean that the practice of Poland and the United States has now changed, and a new rule of international law saying torture is okay has developed. It just means the Polish are doing something for political reasons, but that's not illegal, and they're violating their own legal obligations. But that's it. So I'm here to say that customary international law has not changed. So everything that was described by Jeff is not approved by customary international law either. So what is the most important rule of international law that you need to know? The most important rule in customary and in international law is the following. No state can extract itself from its international obligations through its domestic law. That's the rule. It's an old rule. No state can extract itself from its international obligations through its domestic law. So what does that mean? It means that every law that goes from the Constitution down in the United States that is a means to extract the United States from its international obligations is of no moment on the international plane. It's still, the United States has the obligation, it is just in breach. And it's a very powerful idea because what happens inside the United States is that international law is looked at in terms of the U.S. constitutional structure and how we do our foreign relations. I.e., we look at international law and we apply, our government interprets the rules and acts this or that way. That's called U.S. foreign relations law. And what you are taught most of the time and told about international law in the United States is really just a U.S. foreign relations law vision, i.e. the U.S. spin on what international law is. Now, the Soviet Union had a spin, the Russians have a spin, the Chinese have a spin, everybody's got their spin. But there is also international law that's looked at in sort of a more neutral vision than the spins of this or that country. So what I try to do is encourage, and that's what I'm trying to do with this initial presentation, to encourage you to understand you have to think in a dual fashion. One, in terms of the international law, vision of international law, and these obligations. And secondly, the way it's taught to you in terms of our government presents to you the U.S. approach to these international law obligations. And to just understand, that's the U.S. foreign relations law vision. Now, on occasion, those two things will mean the same thing. And so you say, there's concordance. But on other occasions, they don't. And that's when you start to see the space between what the U.S. is doing and these international law rules. And you start to say, there's something going on here. I need to think about what's going on. Why is this all important? Well, I'll talk to you in 2 or 3 examples. For example, war in Iraq. Simple. War in Iraq from the point of view of U.S. law, authorization to use military force, yada yada. Congress does all that kind of stuff. From the point of view of international law, it's aggressive war. Why? No self-defense basis for it. Secondly, no authorization by the UN Security Council. So if you don't have those 2 things, what do you have? Try to find some residual stuff of self-defense, but you know, on the whole, it's like an aggressive war. In fact, it was said at one point, and then the question is what to do with an aggressive war. Well, internally, we don't talk in terms of that as being aggressive war or something like that, but that is exactly what the issue becomes when you look at it from the international point of view. What happens internally is we start to look at the war in Iraq as a mode of intervention as to be compared with, for example, the Libyan thing going on here, or some other intervention, or Afghanistan. And that's the way in the internal kind of dialogue you look at it. But on the international plane, at least, you know, the question is, do you have a Security Council resolution that's authorizing this, or is there some kind of self-defense or under armed attack type of thing that affects it? And when you look at it under that kind of vision of the international side, you look at the war in Iraq in the way that people around the world talk about it quite easily as just an aggressive, what's called aggressive war, which is, of course, the worst war crime, or the worst crime of the constellation of crimes on the international plane, aggressive war. So then you understand why there might be an issue with the war in Iraq on the international plane and within the way we act there. Second kind of area that we could talk about could be torture. I do a lot of work on torture. There are international rules on torture, and I'm not going to do all the memos analysis thing that you've seen so many times. But just understand that the U.S. government, Don, you and the others, made up out of thin air a standard to define torture. Well, define something that was torture as not being torture, all right? That didn't make it not torture. All it did is it made noise that sounded like law that made it appear like it was something legal under U.S. domestic law. But as a matter of international law, it's still torture, okay? So it's those kinds of separations that you need to keep in mind. I want to add, I could speak about some other things with regards to the issues of national security and all that. There are in international law rules that say that once there's a declared public emergency, there are certain kinds of things that the state can suspend doing. But one of the things that they say that you can't do in that, even in a setting of public emergency, is torture. So torture can't happen in a public emergency. Torture is not supposed to happen during wars. There's a whole Geneva Convention structure and all that. So with all that stuff on the international plane, what happens on the American plane is that there's an effort by very bright people, and you don't be under any illusion, to just redefine things, come up with new words, and most importantly, keep you ignorant to the international law aspects of it. So you go along and with what they're saying. A second aspect, of course, of what they do is they cause you fear so that you acquiesce. in what they're saying. They must be right. Those people are bad and all that. They're out to kill me. They're coming in my house. Oh, they're under my sink, whatever. You get to those points of fear, and fear is a very, as we see, powerful thing for all of us that is anesthetizes us and makes us sort of hesitate. Now, another part of fear is that there is surveillance, and talking about surveillance. I figure that in this room there is a person who is supervising or surveilling us. So I'm going to say hello to that person. I don't know who you are. Or they may be on the mic, or they may be in the mall. I don't know. But, you know, they are here, okay? And so here we are together, all right? So if that person is hearing me, who is here, you know, welcome, okay? Now, let's think about how we're having a conversation without knowing we are, all right? You and me, whoever you are, right? I know who I am. You know who you are. But we don't know who we are. You know? Isn't that heavy? Okay? Now, just meditate on that concept, all right? You go through your life and you think that whatever you do is being surveilled. That can cause fear, right? So all I want to say to you is just assume that everything you do is seen by somebody who is surveilling you, okay? Just assume that. And then just go about your life. Okay? Just understand, you know, don't worry about am I being watched or not. Just assume you're being watched, like in the Soviet Union. Just assume it. And then just go through your life, all right? Like say, fuck the state, there. Why? Fuck the surveillance state. There, okay? There. Now, write it down. Okay? Why? Why? Why am I doing that? It's about freedom, okay? It's about that thing that we have that's so cherished in us. Like in New Hampshire, there's the motto, live free or die. I lived in New Hampshire for 3 years, right? And it's kept coming back to me. How powerful a concept those people had. Live free or die. So you have to say when you're in front of your fear, what is it to be free? I mean that. What is it to be free? Now, I'm not saying you feel anything that I just said, but if the fact that there's a person from a surveillance state who is watching you makes you not act free, then you have to think about why are you cowering in that sense. And if you want to take another image of a person who I think really typifies this, it's a guy named Corey Giles. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy. But if you go to Salem, you know, where the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, they tell you the story about this guy named Corey Giles, who was a farmer there, okay? And so he's out farming, doing whatever they do in those rocky soil of Massachusetts, and people came up to him and said, hey, Corey, what do you think about them witches? And he was like, what are you talking about? He said, you know, all them witches down there, they're dealing with, you know, cotton gather and all the rest of them. He said, oh, will you stop that nonsense? There are no witches around here. Now, leave me alone. I got to go to work. And then nobody else would come and say, hey, Corey, what do you think of all that witch trial stuff, man? Oh, you heard about that? And he's like, what are you talking about? Man, leave me alone. I got 4 kids to feed. I got stuff. Leave me alone. So what happens? Everybody says, hey, you know what? Corey's not on board. Oh, yeah? Yeah, he's not on board. Well, you know what? But I think he's a witch. Okay? So they arrested Corey. And they took him down. They said, Corey, testify. You know, and stand trial. Back in the day, you had to agree to stand trial. But he didn't want to stand trial. And so what they did back in the day is they pressed you, which was either you confessed or you agreed to stand trial. Now, to press you, what they do is they lay you down on the ground and they put rocks on you until you either agree to stand trial or you confess. All right? So that's what they did to Corey. Corey's put down there with all the people with the robes and all the, you know, official people, right? You know, the judge and the jury and whatever you got at the time. And they are pressing him, they're putting rocks on him. So now Corey agreed to have a stand trial or confess. And do you know what Corey Giles said? He said, put another rock on. Put another rock.
Because if he went ahead and was tried and all that, what would happen is that if he got convicted, which was likely of being a witch, all his property gets confiscated. And then that means his 4 kids would lose their inheritance. So there's a dad for you. Okay? All right? So that's the thing I'm trying to emphasize, is that if you are not being pressed as much as Corey was, you still have some space to be free. Okay? And so, please, I want to encourage that in you, that idea of being free. Now, with regards to international law, I want to emphasize some very heavy things that are going on right now. It just happened the last couple of weeks in our country. Of course, you've heard of military commissions, right? And the whole thing that those are kangaroo processes. They really are. I can't explain it all to you. Go through it. They are, these military commissions are kangaroo processes. And then, once the military commission's made a decision, they have a court of military commission appeal that's supposed to look over to see if the law was applied properly in those military commissions. And there are 2 decisions that have come down recently with regards to questions on which people have been convicted, and these Al-Qaeda types down in Gitmo have been convicted. And one of them related to the idea of the, I think it was Hamdan, who was convicted of being, providing material support to terrorism. And the other one is a guy named Al-Balul, who's questioned about conspiracy. Now, material support for terrorism, as you heard about the USA Patriot Act, was passed as a law that applies in the courts. But military commissions are supposed to apply what's called the laws of war. And one of the things that is going on to denature the law right now in the military commission process is that things like the equivalent, what the courts try to do is to find a case in the past, a precedent where this crime was seen. Because somebody cannot be charged with a crime of law of war crime if it isn't a law of war crime. So there's been an effort to go way back to try to look at all the cases that have happened to see if there's something that is equivalent to material support for terrorism that happened in the past, going back to 1700, so to speak, inside the United States. Well, one of the problems is that you go to places like the war against the Seminole Indians in Florida that Andrew Jackson did in the 1820s or 30s or so, where the Seminole Indians were keeping or helping runaway slaves get away from the South. And so Andrew Jackson was there fighting a war against the Seminole Indians to grab their land because he was protecting slavery. And there just happened to be a couple British guys who were around there. And there's a case that was happened with regards to them where Andrew Jackson had, as a general, had these guys court-martialed. Well, in the 1880s, a guy named General Winthrop, an American general, who said that what Andrew Jackson had done back then in 1820, in 1880 would have been murder. Okay, that's 130 years before now. 1880 is not thought of as a very modern time. But he said that it was completely illegal what had been done by Jackson in 1830. Well, guess what? That Seminole War military quote-unquote commission thing is trying to be argued as providing the basis for the material support for terrorism, law of war crime, to be trying people in the last year or so. Now, the other thing is that that's a U.S. game, and international law is international. There isn't an equivalent law rule that's developed on the international plane. So what you're saying is some foreigner is going to be charged with a crime that doesn't exist on the international plane for doing something, I don't know, in Afghanistan, based by the U.S., in the U.S., under a commission of the U.S., under a domestic U.S. rule that comes from a bad period that was denounced 130 years ago. Wow. That's how heavy it's getting. And so that's one level of us trying to denature the law of war. And then, of course, the next part of the effort is to have the international plane accept these kinds of rules and have the change in the customary international law rules or have some treaty put in place. so that that becomes part of the rule for everybody in the world. Second thing is with this Al-Balul case, it's the idea of conspiracy. And they go to the international level, they cite Nuremberg and all these international tribunals, but the bottom line is that none of those tribunals support this idea of the conspiracy as a law of war crime. So you have judicial proceedings, these military commissions, where people have been convicted of crimes that Congress passed as legislation. Okay, they're in the legislation passed by Congress, and the actual background for those law of war crimes is that they do not exist as a matter of international law. Okay? This is the U.S. internal game. And what I tried to say at the beginning is that no state can extract itself from its international obligations through its domestic law. So you have Congress passes a law for a crime that doesn't exist in international law. People run around, bright lawyers, try to find some precedent in the past that they can hobble together, come to the dark areas of some of American history, find some nasty situation that happened, and then try to bring it out of that as a basis for charging these guys who we hate today, okay? And you have that stuff coming up from that dark part of our history that's being reused today. That's the stuff I call the dark matter, okay? It's that kind of part of our history. In fact, there was a judge, who had one of the Hamdan cases when Hamdan was trying to block his military commission, who said, folks, and this was Oberdictor, it wasn't his rule, but as Oberdictor, he said, listen, watch out here, folks. This case has got to not be like, and he cited some 1930 Chambers v. Florida case about some black guy being beat up by the sheriff in Florida and some horrendous sort of image that you've seen sort of out of that whole period. And he was talking about not some black guy in America, but about Hamdan, this guy from Jordan, and what he was going for. So it's just really dark matter. That's the second part of what I'm saying. Now I am out of time, so I will stop by saying this. Your role is to bring light to dark matter. I think that is the deal that is there for all of us during this period. And we can't fear doing this. And we have to break down some of the blinders in our head. I'll give you one blinder I've gone through over the last year. That's where I'll end. Okay, I promise. 2 minutes. I got contacted out of the blue by a guy named Vincent Bugliosi a couple of years ago. They said he wanted me to do some research on a criminal prosecution in California state courts of George Bush for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He did a book. Came out as #1 bestseller, 2008, on the New York Times list, where he talked about all this. But he wanted to look at state court. And so it's like, okay, criminal prosecution of a former president in state court. 99% of the law schools in this country do not teach you anything about state criminal law. 99% of the law schools in this country do not teach you anything about former presidents. It's all a constitution about when they're president. But one of the things I found very interesting was in my head I had to first start to separate George Bush as the president and George Bush as a human being. And I went back to James Madison, whose face I believe is on the cover of the Federalist Society. And one of the things that he wrote was that, don't worry, when we're thinking of a president, we're not thinking of a king. We're thinking of a president more like a governor. And I went, oh, Blagojevich. Okay, we prosecute Blagojevich, right? Okay. And he's out of power, so but it was like freeing my mind of this idea. Now there's complications, I'm not sure, but it's those kinds of latent things we have in ourselves that we just think the world is a certain way because we've been indoctrinated that way. And freeing our mind is really the heart of the deal, and exercising from there. Now I stop. Thank you.